Hey guys, welcome back to the channel for part 2 of the Mega Moto 212 assembly videos from Go Power Sports. I purchased this with my own money, no support from Go Power Sports, but it is a really nice kit. We have hit a little bit of a snag though. The assembly instructions assume that everything's already built. Basically, the next step in the instruction book is to put oil in the engine and take it for a ride. I think we have a little bit more work to do before we can do that. Follow along, we'll make some more progress. Thanks for watching. Based on the instructions that we have for the front part, I think we can kind of fill in the gaps here and figure out what we've got to do to get the rest of this put together. We've got a rear wheel that we need to install, we've got some drive equipment that needs to go in, and we've got some body work that needs to go on this thing. So let's start out with putting the jack shaft in. This bag has the jack shaft assembly in it. We've got a keyway, a sprocket, the shaft itself, some big nuts and washers, etc. And we need to figure out how it all goes together. Obviously, these nice bearings that we've got here on this tube are where we need to mount the jack shaft. The small sprocket is going to go on the far side here, where it runs back to the large sprocket on the wheel. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 teeth. Let's shove this through. A little tap with the plastic hammer. Now that we've got our jack shaft through the bearing, put a washer on there. Put a keyway in. We've got our small sprocket. Going through the hardware bags, I found what looks like to be the appropriate size bolt for that, with a large washer to hold everything together. However, I'm thinking we probably should put a little dollop of Loctite on that. Let me grab the Loctite out of the toolbox and we'll make sure it's not going to come apart. Blue Loctite would be the better choice for this. Red is actually a little bit better, but it tends to hold a little bit too well. A lot of times you need heat to get it off. However, I think we can safely say that red Loctite does a better job of holding than the blue. So that's what we have, that's what we use. I've never really had any trouble getting red apart, but if you guys are trying to follow this video to see how to assemble one of these, by all means use blue. Here's the two halves to our clutches. We start off with the clutch open in the front so that we have a small diameter, and closed in the back so that we have a large diameter, giving us the most advantageous starting gear ratio. But as the speed of the belt increases, or as the speed of the engine increases, this will ramp, kind of hard to do by hand, but this will ramp, opening this up, allowing the belt to fall down into the center, and weights in here will close this front pulley, and we'll get more of a 1-to-1 gear ratio, and that'll give us a higher top speed. Not that this thing is a speed demon, but you get the idea. On this side, we're going to put another washer, another key. We're going to slide on the driven pulley, another washer, and we've got a nice nylock nut. It takes a 24mm socket, put it on a 1/2-inch drive. Again, I'm going to put a little bit of red Loctite on there. With the nylock nut, it's not really all that super necessary, but I really don't want that coming apart. And that's nice and smooth. I think a logical next step is to get the rear wheel up in place here. However, based on the instructions from the front, I think it's safe to say we should be putting the rear fender on before we put the rear wheel up in place. Probably make it easier to get out the bolts, etc. A nice little bag of some grommets and spacers and things like that. Looks like rear fender hardware to me. We've got a nice rubber grommet here with a spacer up the center. I'll start off by feeding that into the fender. Get it seated nicely on both sides. Brass colored spacer goes on the bottom, I believe. Repeat with the second one. There are captured nuts or welded nuts up here. So I think it's safe to say we just need to put a bolt up through. We'll start those into the holes, and we have 4 holes, well 2 on each side, that mount here and on the other side as well. A nut, a bolt, and a rubber washer. I think we can safely guess that the rubber washer will go in between the fender and the bracket. Hopefully we can just start these in place, and then the nut on the inside. Now I rinse and repeat on the other side. The bolt uses an 8mm socket and the nut uses a 10mm wrench. And we probably don't want to over tighten these. Don't want to break the fender. Next we have our adjustment bolts that go on. These capture the axle that is going to go through. It allows you to evenly adjust your chain tension and wheel tracking. We'll just set these in for now. This is our caliper hold down bracket. It's got a bushing similar to what we get for the other side. There's a welded nub here on the inside of the frame and a square notch in this that is going to hold the caliper bracket. Here's our rear wheel. We start the bolt through the hole, being sure to capture the chain tensioning bracket. We put our bushing on, and we whack the camera. Hold the wheel up in place. One of the tricks for doing this is the bearing is kind of inset in the sprocket plate here. Let me bring this up so you can see. So this, when it's sitting here, doesn't leave enough room. It's got to be down in the hole. And likewise on the other side, we've got to be on that bushing. So we kind of have to put the tire up in place. You guys can't see anything. My big fat arm's in the way. But unfortunately, doing this single-handed, I don't have a whole lot of choice. And there we are. Now we need the chain tensioning bolt that fell on the floor. Let me grab those and move you guys back a little bit out of the way. Chain tensioning bolt just slips on. Then we put our nut on. And we don't have our chain in place yet, so we can't tighten anything up. We'll just leave that kind of sitting like that for the moment. Here's our chain. Nothing terribly fancy. It's a 420 chain, which is reasonably stout for a small power application like this. You can see we've got our master link here. Take a pair of needle nose pliers, hook one side of the needle on the pin, and just give that little clip a little squeeze, and the clip pops off. Careful not to lose it. Pull it off of there. The outer plate off. Disconnect the chain. Feed the chain up in and around where we need it to be. Connect it. Get back to our master link. Put the outer plate back on. Feed the large hole here over top of the second pin, and we slide it down so that it's almost engaged. And we take the needle nose pliers and give it a little bit of a clip. You'll notice that the closed end of this clip is pointing forward. As the tire rotates, you'll see the direction the chain is going. You want the master link to always face forwards so that the natural flow of the chain is pushing that clip into the on position. Now we can snug up this rear wheel a little bit. To tension up our chain, there's little notches on the sides by these bolts that line up with graduations in the side of the frame, and we'll take a deep 10mm socket and we'll just buzz this in. A little too tight. We're lined up third from the front on that side. I'll buzz this side in so that we're about the same. The chain is going to stretch some, so after we put a few miles on the bike, we're definitely going to have to readjust this. And we are lined up perfectly on both sides. We're just a little bit ahead of that third notch. So now we can snug up this rear wheel. We've got our brake caliper that's going to attach this bracket that's at the rear. We got a bunch of these nice grommet pieces that need to get hooked into the appropriate holders on the frame, and then they need to get bent closed. Before we get too carried away, we've got to get the this caliper to open up. It's collapsed a little bit, kind of like the front one was, but now we've got the wedge out of the master cylinder. Put a little bit of pressure on here. See if we can force these pistons back. Oh yeah, no problem. Now again, we've got the problem. We have to sort through the parts and decide which bits and pieces appear to work with our brakes. We've got no instructions. I have to be honest, I enjoy having no instructions and kind of figuring it out as we go along. Going through the parts bin here, the parts bags that we have, this looks to be about the only thing that's going to fit in the brake caliper. I thought it was this one at first. Actually, I even tried installing it. It's a little bit too long. If we put the washer and lock washer on this and install it, it should be just about perfect. But we definitely are going to put a little bit of Loctite on there. A little dab will do you, because I don't trust lock washers. I am basically able to pull the brake handle all the way back to the handlebar before the brakes completely lock up. So that tells me there's probably a little bit of air somewhere in the system, but we'll bleed that out. There's the bleeder valve, kind of at the high point. Likewise at the front, bleeder valve is up at the high point, and we can bleed those brakes out a little bit later if need be. Next item to go on is the foot pegs. We've got a spring, a pin, takes a cotter pin, and a washer, and we want to put the spring in there so that it holds the foot peg in the down position. We hook this over top of the frame, give everything a little bit of a push. We take our washer, drop the cotter pin down through the hole, and roll it over. Now if we drop the bike foot peg, we'll fold over instead of digging in and bending something. Next item we'll give a try to install here is the kickstand. And our kickstand is threaded on the back side with the pin. I think that's going to need some Loctite on it. Good and snug, and the spring is on there to keep it up in place while we're riding. Hey guys, it's a couple of days later here. Camera overheated on me the other evening, and it was pretty well time to call it a night anyways. So I did do a couple things before I shut it down for the evening. We've got the side panels just kind of put in place here. They fit into some rubber grommets, and I got the voltage regulator mounted. Although I see it's not the straightest in the world, we'll need to get that fixed up, and I've plugged the wiring harness into it. We've got a few more jobs to do here, and again, this is nothing that's listed in the manual. We're kind of making it up as we go along at this point. We've got some chain guards that need to be installed. This one goes here, one down at the bottom, and one that runs along the top of the chain. And then it's time to mount the engine. Exciting! Let me get some more progress made here. I'll bring you guys along for the ride, and we'll hopefully get this tidied up today. Here's our simple little chain cover that's got to go on here. Unfortunately, there's a big ball of weld right here, and the chain guard won't quite go back up in place. Grab a die grinder. We'll just buzz that plastic off ever so slightly so that it clears that big ball of weld. Before we get that going, we've got our main chain cover that goes in here. It has threaded holes with nuts welded in the back there that this attaches to, and then these two attach to the bike. However, one of the tabs, and I don't know how it happened, is quite bent and will need to be straightened out. And then we have our final chain guard that just goes on right there. M6 bolts, but they've got a 8mm head on them. Those just thread in. And we can snug up. That should kind of deflect the worst of the sticks and whatnot out of the chain. The last thing we want is a stick to go in here and get wrapped around and kick the chain off. You can see that tab is all bent up. That tab is supposed to be straight so that it holds the top chain guard properly in place. Try and get in here with a pair of channel locks and see if we can bend that tab back down. Would have been nice if I had noticed that this was a problem before we put the rear wheel on. Would have been easier to deal with. But I think that is quite doable right there. Throw a couple of these little bolts in here. And our final one that we've got to do up, a little bit of massaging. See the little notch I ground in here with the die grinder just to clearance that weld. If the weld had been on the backside, this wouldn't be necessary, but minor adjustment to have to make. We've got a couple of these nice little M6 bolts that need to be threaded in here, and then one that goes through the top. We've got all those tightened down. I'm going to spin over the rear wheel. Doesn't sound like anything is dragging on a chain guard, so that's a good sign. The next item on the list is our throttle assembly. There's a couple of Phillips head screws. Hold the two halves of the throttle together. We've got a cable guide and we've got our twist grip. Twist grip will go in like this and we'll pull the cable through. Here's our throttle cable. We start off by threading it in. We'll put it in as tight as it'll go, and that's just so that we have the most adjustment to pull it out afterwards. Work the cable out. We put our guide in place so that the cable has a nice smooth path to run over. The cable fits into the round notch. Then there's a slot. They go together, and we'll just loosely install the top cover because we have to slide this over the handle grip. The final tightening will happen after we put the throttle grip on the handlebar. Feed the cable through. I'm not sure what the best routing is going to be, or best routing will be for that. That doesn't look too bad. And there's the other end of the cable. I don't know whether that's coming up on camera or not, but that's our throttle stroke. Well, that certainly fills the hole. Unfortunately, we've got a little bit of interference going on here. There's an emissions box that is attached to the tins underneath here that we're probably going to end up deleting anyways, but its bracket is hitting the cross shaft, so we're going to have to move that or do something with it for the time being. This is the emissions box I was telling you about. A couple of hoses that are running from the fuel system or running to the fuel tank and from the carburetor, I think. Take that off, and 8mm socket. Let's see how this thing fits up in there now. I'm getting a little bit of contact on one of the tins right here, but if that's all the problem is, then we can clearance that a little bit. I'm going to drop a couple of bolts in to align on the motor plate. That's got 3 of the bolts down in the holes just to kind of hold everything in alignment. There is a little bit of adjustment, but that will be required for the to get the clutch and everything lined up. Now we're no longer making contact, but I tell you, there's only about 1/8 of an inch of clearance down in here from the front wrap of the chain to the sheet metal on the motor. I'll take the air box off here and the air filter. Couple of Phillips head screws hold the base of the air filter housing onto the top of the carburetor. And the reason I'm taking this off is so that we can get at where we attach the throttle cable. Interestingly, I had read that these Predators didn't come with the hardware for attaching a throttle cable, but that information was obviously incorrect. This is the hold down clamp that the throttle cable sleeve will connect to. Over here we have the B-nut. That is where the end of the cable will attach. Now, this is a little on the stiff side. I'll have to back this nut off here to reduce the friction on this arm assembly. And hey, look, we've even got another B-nut here that we could use if we had to come off of this cable clamp. That's interesting. Let me put you back on the stand. We'll get this motor bolted down because I think everything is going to work just fine. I do see one problem that we're going to have, however. The exhaust outlet is right here. It's going to be basically blowing right on the rear fender. Now, I don't plan on keeping this exhaust on here all that long. I do plan on getting a header style exhaust that's going to come off of the engine, come out either right across the top here and down the side, or down the other side, depending which style I get. However, for now, I just want to run this thing in bone stock condition just to see how it's going to perform. Let's get this motor bolted down. Motor mount bolts are in here, and then we can start running the throttle cable and connecting up some wiring so we can stop and start this thing. Terrible angle, I know. I've got those 4 bolts holding the motor in place are snug down. I didn't want to get too carried away tightening them because I have a sneaking suspicion when we start messing with the CV clutch on the other side that we're going to have to adjust our position of our motor a little bit. While we've got things set up on this side, I think I'm going to try and run the throttle cable. And that is approximately where it is going to have to land. I need to find a way to tuck that up in there so that it's not going to cause any problems. We've got a cable hold down at the front here with the brake and the wiring harness and everything is in that. We'll run the throttle cable across the front of the engine. It's got like a protective sleeve on it. Obviously, it's kind of designed to run like that. And then we will feed it in here under the lip of the fuel tank. We'll back the sleeve clamp off a little bit, tighten that down. I'm going to check this back one, make sure that it is snug, and also that the B-nut that we're not using isn't going to wander off. We back out the B-nut that we are going to use, and then we feed the throttle cable into the B-nut. Feed the throttle cable into the B-nut. We are at idle, high, full speed, or at idle all the way down. We are at idle on the throttle, so we'll snug that down. I don't want to get too carried away tightening it just yet. A little bit of on there. Need it clamp down bolt backed off. Obviously, we're going to need a little bit more throttle return. Also, we've got a full throttle stop screw. I'll get it out of there. This screw was preventing the throttle from opening all the way. That throttle return spring is not doing a really great job. If I just let off on the throttle, you'll notice that it doesn't come back to idle. That's idle. We need a little bit more throttle return. And there, that is our throttle return spring. And it isn't very good, and I get the feeling that if we run this thing at full throttle for very long, that we're going to end up stretching that spring, and then we'll have no return. I dug through an assortment of springs that I have in a little kit I think I got from Harbor Freight at one time. I found these little springs here, and it looks to me like that will work just about perfect if we put it between the hold down screw for the cable sleeve and the second B-nut, and that'll hold a little bit of additional tension on there. Hopefully this spring is long enough so that the full throttle part of it works fine. I do have a little bit longer spring, and I'm worried that it isn't going to quite have enough tension to pull things back to idle. So we'll screw the bolt through the eye of the spring. And we'll pull the screw out of the B-nut here. And that certainly will put a little more pressure on the throttle to pull it back to idle. Both those are good and tight. Let's see how the throttle works. Seems to pull back quite nicely to idle now. I've got the recoil mounted back up here, or the fan shroud and recoil. One thing you got to be careful of when you are putting these fan shrouds back on is you've got these governor rods and a spring that are in here, and they control the actual position of the throttle to the carburetor. This is kind of a suggestion that tells the governor you want more speed. The governor then increases the throttle opening up to the point where it hits its target RPM of, I believe it's 3650 or... Anyways, if these rods are caught underneath the cover when you're bolting everything back down, your engine will be stuck at full throttle, and that won't be a good thing. Another thing that we want to do before we put the air cleaner back on this thing and swap around to the other side is we want to attach this vent tube from the tank into the carburetor. It used to connect up to this emissions box, and we no longer do that. I guess this is some kind of fuel filter or something. Not really sure what, but we're going to connect it up directly to the air box here so that it sucks any vapor in the top of the tank into the engine and burns it off. Take one of the lock rings, put it over that, and plug it directly into the carburetor. I'll bring you guys up so you can see what exactly I've got going on here. This is the vent line here that we just cut off. I got it kind of tucked in underneath the spark plug lead so it doesn't get up on the exhaust, and then we're attached to the air box. There's a barb fitting sticking out the back of the air box here. That'll allow any fuel vapor that collects in the top of the tank to get sucked into the carburetor when you run the engine. That makes me much happier. I'm going to put the air box back together, and then we'll turn the bike around and we'll get the CV clutch kind of sorted out. We're on the CV side of the engine here, and I've backed the engine bolts off just a little bit so we have some slack to work with. What we need to do now is make sure that the crankshaft is perpendicular to the back sheaves of the clutch. What we can do is take our back sheave for our driver side of the clutch and push it on, and we've got the back sheave of our driven pulley, and we need to put a straight edge across there, and I do have one here somewhere on the bench that will make sure that we're lined up. We want to be, as close as we can fore and aft, and we also want to make sure that there's no twist to the engine. I've got the straight edge held against the back sheave of the driven pulley here, and we seem to be a little bit too far this way, and also the motor is sitting this way because there's a good gap, about a 1/16 of an inch gap at the front. Let's see if we can do something about that. So first of all, we need to twist the engine that way. I think we're pretty good there. Let me snug one of these bolts back up and we'll check it again. I think we can make that work. I'm going to snug all these bolts down good and solid, and I'll bring you guys back when we're ready to start putting the clutch together. I got the engine bolted down solidly, all four corners, and I lay that across, and it is pretty much perfect. Alignment between this sheave and this sheave should be just fine. Before we can mount the driver side of the clutch in place, however, we do have a few brackets that have to go in, and we've got this nice clutch cover that has to go on here like that, and these brackets are what mounts the clutch cover to the bike. Because the website warned me that this did not come with an appropriate bolt for the end of the clutch, I picked up this clutch kit from Amazon or eBay, I forget which. It should give us bolts that are suitable for bolting these brackets on. I don't think... No, these threads are not the right ones for this engine. Definitely, we don't want these bolts vibrating loose, because we get into the backside of the pulleys. So I'll just put a little bit of Loctite on there. snug these up with the impact. Make sure that it doesn't hit the driven pulley. Got these snugged down good. We've got our the back side of our driven pulley. We've got this brass bushing that goes on here, and that allows the belt to kind of slip a little bit when you're in neutral. Helps with your neutral performance. I want to make sure that we aren't hitting any of the bolts we just put in with the pulley, and everything looks good. What we've got here is our the outer sheave of our drive pulley. We've got a couple of springs that go around the outside. These are weights here, and as you speed up, they spring out, kind of following these rails, and they force this to tighten on the shaft. You can see the center, it can slide on the center bushing here. We take our outer sheave and lay it in place. Now we've got our nice long bolt. We want to make sure that it'll go in far enough into the end of the crankshaft. That's as far in as it'll go. Unfortunately, we need to trim that back a little bit. Now this is to a certain degree part of the complication. The bike manufacturer doesn't know exactly what engine you're going to put on here. Are you going to put a Tillotson 212? Are you going to put a Predator 212? Are you going to put some kind of genuine Honda on here? There's many different engines that you come up with. So that's why it's necessary to kind of roll your own when it comes to dealing with the thread engagement on this crankshaft. So definitely we're going to have to take about 1/4 inch off the end of this, and we'll see how that does. Let me do that, and we'll give it another try. I've taken 1/4 inch off the end of the bolt. I've got a lock washer and a big fender washer. Hey, we are in. Unfortunately, I didn't put any Loctite on that because I didn't think it was actually going to grab. So we'll have to take that bolt back out of there just to be on the safe side. But at least we know that we're in good and tight. Just to be on the safe side, we'll put a 13mm wrench on there. Good. The impacts seem to do a decent job. I'm always a little bit hesitant to use this impact to torque things down. It is a fairly light duty one. We've got our belt. Notice that one side is flat and the other side is tapered. The flat side up against the flat sheaves at the back, and put the tapered side up against the tapered sheaves at the front. I think we're fairly decent there. Now, one thing we do need to do before we try and start this is we need to put some oil in it. Shows a little bit on the bottom of the dipstick, but we're tilted this way. That's not a good way of judging how much oil you've got. Harbor Freight provided this nice little funnel there, and I'm going to put some good stuff in this. I'm going to put some Rotella T4 10W30 into this engine. And yes, I know this is diesel, but my understanding is that this has added zinc, which is good for flat tappet cams, which is what this has. And rather than putting a zinc additive in after the fact, I figure that we'll just use the good stuff to start with. Now, I don't expect we're going to have this oil in here all that long. As I say, there's some modifications I want to make to this engine, and also generally these engines end up with a whole bunch of garbage floating around in the bottom of them after they're run a little bit, and they don't really take a whole lot of oil. Half a quart or a liter if you are so inclined. Let that oil run down in, and I'll show you what I got for this thing. I picked up a nice machined aluminum oil dipstick and oil plug. It's got a nice little magnet at the end, as you can see. So all of the junk, the metal grindings that'll be floating around inside the engine will hopefully end up stuck to this. It's a matter of pulling this out, wiping it off, putting it back in, and you'll get rid of some of the grindies. Now we need to make sure that the engine is relatively level when we check the oil. We'll use the factory dipstick. These engines do come with 2 dipsticks. There's another one in the back here, but with this application, of course, it's in behind the driven pulley, and we can't get at it. So there's a little bit of oil on the end of the dipstick, but we're still a little ways to go. Proper oil level is critical on these small engines like this because they use splash oil lubrication. There's a dipper on the bottom of the connecting rod that goes in and scoops up a little oil and throws it all over the inside of the engine. Larger small engines of this sort go to a pressurized oil system, but the 212, the 224, any of these single lung small blocks, I guess you would call them, are going to use the splash oil system for lubricant. Okay, we are up to the top of the dipstick. So let's put our fancy one in. It also says we're up good, and that's got the oil. I kept the plastic cover on the seat, keep the worst of the mechanics tracks under control. There's our seat, already getting oily fingerprints on it. This attaches to a bar that's right here, 2 bolts that are in the back of the frame that hold it in place. We have one last little problem that I neglected to deal with when we were putting the engine in, and that is that the recoil is not in the right direction. I think we want it to be going up, not forward. However, to do a first start, going forward up on the bench here is just about perfect. Let's turn our fuel on. We're in the choke is on, the bike kill switch is theoretically on, and the throttle is at idle. Now with any luck, this thing will fire up and won't go scooting across the table and make a big mess. Also, the kill switch at the front of the engine is on. That's important too. That is legitimately the first pull. That's the first time I've tried starting this engine. And the kill switch up on the handlebar works. That's the first time, like legitimately, that is the first time I tried starting this engine and it started on the first pull. That is pretty impressive. Let's fix the recoil and then we'll see if we can figure out how to get it outside. Oh, here's the Mega Moto 212 out in the sunshine. A little bit of a struggle to get it out of my, shall we say, messy garage. But let's take this thing for the ride up and down the alley and see how it does. Well, the back fender is getting a little on the warm side. It's not melting yet by any means, but I didn't ride it very far. But wow, does this thing ever scoot! The clutch stalls a little higher than I would have expected it to. I had a Baja Warrior a few years ago, and it stalled quite a bit lower than this one. This machine, you kind of got to get it wound up a little bit before the torque converter stalls out on it. But it's a nice smooth engagement, no problems at all. And as I say, wow, does this thing ever scoot! It goes faster than I'm comfortable riding it. You know, given that it's just a little tiny bike with hardly any suspension to it. A little bit of cleanup needs to happen on the wiring. I've got to figure out what I'm going to do, getting a lighting coil fired up and running, and other than that, I think we're in pretty good shape. So I think we'll call this one finished for now. Check back, we'll be doing some modifications to the engine, although I gotta say, going faster isn't really necessary. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Appreciate you checking out the video, and if you can, give me one of those thumbs up, and a subscribe would be nice. Ring that bell icon, and we'll catch you guys in the next mess.